We are dealing with quasi-public spaces, right? And I want to dispense with the argument that we all hear so frequently. Well, it's a private company, it can do what it wants. Well, it is a private company. However, it is managing a quasi-public space. Airports are, by and large, privately held. If airports decide they want to arbitrarily decide that, Republicans can't fly, that's obviously a problem. And you can make the same argument. They're private corporations. They can provide service to whoever they like. I'm sorry, no. If you have effectively private corporations allowed to set up a no-fly list based on political orientation, you have a serious problem immediately. Likewise, hospitals, often privately held. Do you really want hospitals to be able to refuse service to people? I mean, we've seen this actually under COVID. We've seen questions about whether or not the so-called unvaccinated were entitled to medical treatment. And yes, I understand that there's a philosophical question there, but there's also this deeper legal question, which is if you're providing a service that is necessary for citizens, you are in a different situation than if you are engaged in some niche activity which is not fundamental to life, like the ability to travel, the ability to enter the public square and participate in a discussion.
I think that I understand the appeal of that argument. The problem that it comes from a legal standpoint and the First Amendment standpoint is this right to association. And your airport or your hospital is an example of non-expressive associational relations. And therefore imposing limitations based on, you can't restrict first based on their viewpoint doesn't impact the purpose of that association, which is to fly somewhere or to provide medical services. But social media is deemed an expressive association. It's media. It's like a newspaper to a certain extent. And even in the right to respond cases, the argument there was the newspaper has this huge platform, and I as an individual can't get out to as many people. Therefore, it's totally unfair because the newspaper has this huge platform. They can totally change the conversation, and I'm helpless to try and respond. And the courts rejected that, saying that that's the nature of the business here. This is still an expressive entity. Therefore, they have a right to choose who they associate with and who they don't associate with. They also note, and a second problem comes to figuring out how to draw the fine lines that, what type of viewpoint can you not discriminate against versus what type of viewpoint, can you discriminate against? And under the First Amendment, the courts have been really clear that if we're going to impose liability, you have to have really bright lines and easy to define lines in place, or else you end up having a fear of chilling. So I think that trying to adopt any law that is based on the viewpoint, prohibiting viewpoint discrimination, it becomes very tricky to do. And that's what we've seen in the Texas law and the Florida law that have both been deemed unconstitutional. The Florida law basically was saying you can't censor political candidates. And that was deemed to be viewpoint-based discrimination that was unconstitutional. But they did permit some of the disclosure requirements. The law also required them to disclose, all the rules that they have for censorship, any changes to those rules, and the number of view counts that you've been getting, so you can try and track the shadow banning. And they held that those were viewpoint neutral rules, and therefore, those disclosure requirements were upheld. They did in the Florida law hold that one of the disclosure requirements, which was a thorough explanation of why you're being censored, was too burdensome and therefore was found to be unconstitutional because of the volume of censorship that they do. It was just deemed to would be impractical to exercise that right. But you can have some type of limitations as long as they're viewpoint neutral. They may have a chance of surviving the First Amendment challenge.
So this, again, goes to the issue of this superspecies, right? On the one hand, I understand the argument that it is technically too onerous to require these platforms to explain every instance of censorship. Probably some, well above 99% of instances of censorship are some tiny account saying something obnoxious, and it's transparent on its face why it's not being allowed. On the other hand, when YouTube doesn't have to explain why it has demonetized our channel, it does not have to point to the statements that it finds to be false, for example, and then the statements that it clearly was responding to turn out to be true, obviously it should reverse the decision, right? And the fact that these platforms do not have to be specific about this stuff means that there is no requirement of consistency for them. They are not required to behave logically. They can just simply effectively decide who they don't like, and they can, put a shackle on. And this is obviously the result of an anachronistic law being applied to modern circumstances that its authors did not understand. I want to say one other thing before we lose it. The argument that it's a private company, it can do what it wants. I understand the appeal of it too. And as much as, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool liberal progressive, and so that's not a native argument to me. I am concerned about things like corporate power, and good regulations are a necessary feature of the landscape as I see it. However, in 2022, boy, do I understand this argument, right? My feeling is we have malignant government, and I want its power minimized, because the way it wields that power is paradoxical. And I would just point out that the argument, the classically libertarian argument, it's a private corporation, it can do what it wants. That argument is actually functioning in the service of aggressive, malignant governance. As we've now discovered, the platforms are apparently meeting with the government, and the government is telling them who it wants censored. So this is a fascist nightmare unfolding on these platforms, hiding behind this libertarian notion that these are private corporations, they can do what they want.
So I think that there's a couple things to address that. The first way that it could be addressed would be, again, going back to tying the immunity from defamation to an agreement that they only censor in good faith based on existing written rules and such. Because clear rules. And so what's happening there, by granting the immunity from defamation, the government is granting a huge benefit to the social media companies. They could not exist but for that immunity from liability. And so when government grants someone a benefit, they can exact a price from that. And that price could be to comply with rules on censorship and limit your censorship to good faith censorship based on pre-written rules, provide clear explanations for that censorship and such. And so if we tied section 1 and 2 together, then that would be address this by requiring social media companies make a choice. You can censor freely in bad faith if you want, but then you don't get the immunity. If you want the immunity, you have to have these clear rules. And that was when under the Trump administration, they put forth a huge proposal on amending Section 230. And this is one of the things that they proposed specifically, was tying these together and having specific rules on, if you want the immunity, you have to have clearly written rules. You have to have an enforcement mechanism, a way to appeal and challenge that ruling. And so it's definitely something that could be fixed in this that would do that. And it's permissible because we're providing that benefit. It's the trade-off, saying if you want this immunity from liability, you have to do something. And I do think that was the original intent, but I think that would address the super beast that we've created by saying that, they have to have clear rules, and that we can actually back that up. I think that the other things that states can do, I think the Florida case that allowed or permitted some of the disclosure requirements, they did say that the thorough explanation of the censorship was impermissible, but I can imagine lesser requirements, such as you need to quote the specific language that you say violates the rules, and you need to identify what that rule is something that states may be able to do on an individual basis without amending Section 230. that I think also would go to at least part of the problem. Because I do think, I mean, one of the biggest complaints that I hear from a lot of the content providers is we don't know what the rules are. I mean, the whole thing of demonetizing DarkHorse, originally that demonetization was our advertisers are making us. But now that, I watch your podcast and they got ads on them.
Yeah,
so obviously
they got ads and they make the money.
So obviously YouTube doesn't think that whatever you're saying is un-ad worthy. They're just doing it for this, whatever, the arbitrary, because they don't like you. And I do think that the even Section 230 censorship does talk about good faith, and the courts have not gone too much into what that actually means. But that may be part of the solution too, is trying to get a good case there that says, this censorship wasn't in good faith. The one case that from the Ninth Circuit that I mentioned earlier on tortious business interference with business expectancy, the court held, well, if you're trying to ruin someone's business, you aren't acting in good faith. So the immunity actually didn't protect him in that case. But that's the most on-point case we have, and we don't really know what the good faith means otherwise. So I do think that we could address this problem without adopting a rule that says you can't discriminate based on viewpoint, because I think that's going to be, it's the First Amendment is going to prohibit that type of limitation. The Florida was really clever in how they did it. They were trying to say that, well, we're doing candidates, and therefore, we have an interest in, basically, if you're censoring one candidate in a race but not the other candidate, you're effectively giving a campaign contribution, and we're allowed to adopt laws on campaign contributions. And even that, the court held, was not a good enough basis to require them to carry out candidates or limit the ability to censor candidates. So it is going to be a really steep road. The second point is that, the Justice Thomas on the Supreme Court has advocated, similar to what you were advocating, is we should treat social media companies like common carriers, which are required to take all comers. And that would, I think, present a different, it would recategorize social media as something else. But, it's, that might work. I think it's going to be hard. There was a case that came out a couple of years ago out of New York, which was a public access channel that was run by a private entity. And the Supreme Court held that that private entity had the First Amendment right to choose who gets channels and who don't, and how they organize it. And I think that logic would apply to social media companies trying to limit based on censorship under the common carrier theory. But that is one of the other theories that are out there.
All right, there are a number of points that I want to catch up on here. One thing I hear missing in what you've described as necessary, and I think it's implied in what you've said, but I want to highlight it, is not only clear rules and an explanation of what you violated, but a process, right? Yeah. There has to be a process, and it has to be transparent, right? The idea that Twitter throws you off because it claims you violated a rule, and then sometimes it'll say, as it did in Jordan Peterson's case, for example, or Dr. Rollergator, you have to delete this tweet, which is offensive. And by doing so, you are admitting that you violated the terms of service, right? And so, talk about catch-22s. That's exactly what they've set up. And there's no mechanism other than, frankly, having your friends shout at them in public, to go in and say, actually, no, I didn't violate the rules, or here are, 17 examples where you have let the exact same behavior or something far more extreme live on your servers, and you've singled me out because of who I am and what I think, not because of what I said, right? You need to have that process.